The biggest challenge on any picture is to follow a vision that threads its way through all of the reefs and shoals of the picture-making process, not least of which are the personalities that you have to deal with and people's egos. When it works well, it's sublime. When it doesn't work so well, it can be a mess. This is a problem you deal with every single time you make a picture, and that is the people who are in charge of writing and directing, do they have the right vision? Are they able to put a vision on the screen that's going to work? And nobody knows. You know, nobody knows if it's going to work. The initial idea to reboot this as a movie and not a TV series turned out to be a brilliant idea. It ended up being probably one of the single best decisions for Paramount as a film company.
Star Trek was too popular to ignore. And the studio tried for a long time,
Oh, they couldn't be bothered with it.
And when they weren't going to bring it back, it was, for pennies. It was going to be a very low-budget movie. It's amazing that Star Trek, ended up being brought back in the biggest way possible. It's one of the most expensive, big-budget movies of all time.
One of Michael Eisner's strongest attributes is being able to recognize exploitable ideas, and exploitable in the best sense of the word. It was his vision to do this. For whatever reason, I mean, yes, Star Wars was a successful picture and it woke us all up, but it was Michael who said, we need to do this. And he said, we're going to release it in December of 1979, which was a little over 2 years away.
There was a process at the time called blind booking, where theaters would commit without actually seeing a movie to pay in advance for release.
There was an unprecedented guarantee that had been made by exhibition for the film a year in advance, and that guarantee was contingent upon the movie being delivered on a date, and without it, it went away. And it was tens and tens of millions of dollars. So there was no such thing as not getting the movie. It was just that was not possible.
All we had was Gene Roddenberry. And we didn't even really know whether we had a cast or not.
I'll get somebody down there as soon as I can, Claire. My people are all tied up now.
Captain, Starfleet just signaled your transfer of command orders, sir.
Captain. I appreciate the welcome. I wish the circumstances were less critical. Mr. Chico.
Aye, sir.
Assemble a crew on the recreation deck at 0400 hours. I want to show them what we're facing.
The reluctance of Leonard Nimoy to do the picture and the insistence that he do the picture, that was an insistence from Michael Eisner and Barry Diller. If they're going to take this risk with $15 million, which turned out to be $40 million, they wanted to have as much insurance as possible. It was the push of the studio to get him involved.
I offer my services as science officer.
The first thing we need to do is we need to have some ideas for directors.
Spielberg's name had been put forth, and a lot of top directors. I think George Lucas had been mentioned, Francis Ford Coppola had been mentioned.
And I suggested Bob Wise. And Michael stopped and said, gee, that's a great idea.
I think it was Tom Parry at Paramount who suggested to Paramount that I might be the best one to direct the film.
And the reason I suggested Bob is I graduated from college in June of 1974, and I came out here looking for a job. There were about a half a dozen people who had agreed to see me, and he was one of them. Within about 2 weeks, I got a job. I got to learn about filmmaking at the foot of a very, very talented and experienced filmmaker. If you give him a picture with all of the complexities of something like Star Trek, he'd be able to handle all of them. So I called Bob, and I said, would you be interested in doing a movie of Star Trek? And Bob said, well, that might be interesting. So in the meeting, he said that he would do it. So Michael turned to me and assigned the picture to me to oversee. Bob comes on, and he was taken on a tour of the sets, and he said he couldn't use them. That was the first expensive decision.
The engine room, which had been built for Phase 2, was deemed unacceptable by Robert Wise. That was pretty much thrown out and redesigned. Matt Jeffries and Joe Jennings, who were going to do production design, are gone. A lot of the people who'd been involved with the TV series are gone. All the money that had been put into Phase 2 was pretty much flushed down the toilet. Meanwhile, there really wasn't a finished script, which ultimately was what the biggest problem with Star Trek the Motion Picture was in terms of production.
At least I did, and perhaps both Bob and I did, both express our doubts to Gene about the script. There was a screenwriter that I liked a lot. His name was Dennis Clark. He had written Comes a Horseman. I called Dennis. Dennis said he'd be interested. We signed Dennis on. And within about 2 weeks of Dennis being on the lot and starting to write the script, he calls me complaining because what Gene was doing was marking up every single word that Dennis was writing because the jargon he was using was not Star Trek jargon. You know, it wasn't, you know, the wrong number of parsecs or the wrong transporter room setting. I was really afraid we were going to lose Dennis. So I went to see Michael. I explained the problem to him. And Michael said, we don't know whether anybody's going to come and see the movie, but at least we do know that all of those Star Trek fans will come. If Gene, at the worst, leaves the movie, but at the best, you know, is told to back off on the script, he may go to the press. He may go to his fans. And then, where are we?
The only hope of keeping things on schedule was to have Harold Livingston come back and rewrite the script.
Began as the TV series, as Star Trek Phase 2, In Thy Image, and I left, I quit. I had heard that they decided to do a big motion picture, so then I got a call on a Saturday night from Roddenberry. Saturday night about 9:30. And he says, hey, how are you? I said, look, it's 9:30 Saturday night. I said, what kind of trouble are you in?
Gene Roddenberry calls up Harold Livingston and says, hey, I want to send you a script.
He wanted me if I'd be interested in taking a look at it.
And he says, okay, I'm sending a messenger. It'll be there in an hour.
I hadn't even said yes when the doorbell rang. It was a messenger with the script. This is Saturday night.
And Roddenberry says, I need you to meet with me and Bob Wise tomorrow.
I said to Wise, I said, Mr. Wise, I said, this is the first time I'd ever met him. I said, I think you better take cyanide with this one. Wise said, as a favor to him, come back, please, and take care of this. And stay through the filming and to see it all the way through. So I couldn't refuse.
In order to make the release date that they wanted at the end of the year, we had to start shooting on the film before we had a final script all the way through. And so it was being rewritten as we were shooting, which is a bad way to make films.
Livingston is offered $10,000 a week to come on and rewrite the script of his that has been rewritten by Dennis Linton Clark.
I took advantage of this with the studio, being the greedy person that I am.
$10,000 a week, not only is a lot now, but it was a hell of a lot of money back then. The stories are legendary because even once they're in production, the script's being rewritten, normally you have colored pages as rewrites come in. Well, what would happen is Livingston would deliver rewrites in the morning, then Gene Roddenberry would rewrite them in the afternoon. So they literally have time code on the colored pages. So, and it would say, you know, 11 o'clock, HL, Harold Livingston, 12:30, GR.
Pages would be coming in even as they were standing on the set. Oh no, here's new lines, learn these, you know, in 5 minutes, and it's going to be, you know, something different than what you have, so forget what you learned. It was tough on the actors.
We were constantly finding, discovering things that didn't work. We had to change them on the spot.
The cast didn't know what to make of it. Shatner and Nimoy had a clause where they had script consultation. And literally, filming would come to a stop on set while these impromptu script conferences would start to happen.
It's insane. It's madness.
This is not the way to make a movie.
Bob Wise was driven quite mad with this.
That's the way Gene worked. He was always rewriting. His method of writing, which he imparted to me, was you write and then you rewrite and rewrite and rewrite on ad infinitum, and especially the first 20 pages of a script that he would write. I would be waiting to see what would happen next, and he'd be going back to page 1 so he could rewrite the first 20 pages, and it was annoying because I wanted to know what happened.
Talking about the pre-production stage, Mr. Roddenberry said, as was normal for any two writers, Harold and I had our love affairs, our fights. He would write something and bring it to me. I'd rewrite it. He'd quarrel over the rewrites. He would rewrite my rewrites. Two writers working together are always like that.
I had to go over and visit the set, you know, hold Bob Wise's hand whenever he got really frustrated.
It was brutal. We really worked hard to make that picture go, and it was a daily grind. I just wanted to make this story work.
And at that point, I wasn't even thinking of post-production. I mean, we were just dealing with all of the issues about getting this thing shot. One day, Jeffrey Katzenburg walks into my office and says, "Tom, I want to make a deal with you." "What's that, Jeffrey?" "Well, I'll trade you all of Airplane for half of Star Trek." I said, "Well, what half of Star Trek do you want?" He said, "Well, I want to learn about post-production." And he said, "There's going to be a lot of, special effects work, and he said, it's such a big project that it's going to be difficult, for one person to oversee the whole thing." And I said, "Well, before I accept, I actually need to read the Airplane script because I simply don't know the picture at all." And when they told me the concept that everything is played straight, it's all played for drama, and all of the comedy happens in the background, I said, "Now that's funny." And so I told Jeffrey, "Fine, you've got a deal."
Jeffrey Katzenburg, of course, is the legend now who partnered DreamWorks, who runs DreamWorks Animation. But at the time, he was a young studio exec who had worked for Charlie Bluhdorn, the chairman of the studio, who had been given this to wrestle this beast to the ground.
And so when Jeffrey said, "Oh, well, let me do post-production," I thought, great, because this will be a nightmare too.
In the course of making this movie, it reminds me as much as anything I've ever been involved with, that law of anything that could go wrong, would go wrong, or can go wrong, and this one sort of, is a world and Olympic record. Nothing didn't go wrong at some point along the way.
Jeffrey then went to work, and for the first 6 months in post-production, he was overseeing the Bob Abel folks.
It was an experience of a lifetime. It was an incredible education. And what was amazing is that it was such a tough post-production challenge on the movie. There were so many people all overlapping, all trying to sort of drive towards this December release date, which everybody said was impossible. It simply would not happen.
Robert Abel and Associates, who was doing the visual effects, who had won Clios for their very imaginative and cutting-edge Levi's jeans campaign, and a bunch of other campaigns, had been hired, but had never really done any features, and was doing the effects.
They immediately set to work stocking up on equipment. They were promising from the very beginning, you'll not only get great special effects, you get state-of-the-art special effects. We're going to push the envelope. And they were bringing in more and more equipment, bought with Paramount's money, of course.
There was a movement to do the effects in 65 millimeter. There's, ultimately for knowing that it was going to be a 70 millimeter release. So I called Richard Edlund up, who was at that time now up in San Francisco, and said, "Hey, Richard, there's a big debate about if it's VistaVision or scope or 65 millimeter, what do you think?"
I came down to LA and I said, one of the things that I implore you to remember is always try to make it as simple as possible, because I guarantee you in the 11th hour it's going to screw up, and then you're going to have to fix it. And if it's real complicated, then you're going to paint yourself into a corner you can't get out of.
Richard categorically stated, if you shoot this movie in 65 millimeter, it's going down in flames. You are making a horrendous mistake. I also knew that if we shot it in scope, that would be a problem because there wasn't sufficient macro lenses, and doing miniatures in scope and stuff was a big pain in the butt. And VistaVision was a very practical format. We had the cameras on order. All we had to do was buy movements, done deal. So I wrote this all up, sent in my report, and of course they immediately chose to do 65 millimeter. Disaster. There was a date set for release, and there was some imaginary schedule that was going to build the studio, figure out how to make all the equipment work, actually do the effects, and get them in composite and onto screen. That original plan was, I believe, about 6 months. And in the middle of all of this, the plan of the model photography, which was pretty important, was to shoot it under motion control controlled by computer graphics that were pre-visual, in other words, a system of pre-visualizing the shot in computer graphics, cutting it into the movie, getting it approved, then going back to the stage and shooting it.
It was the wireframe type shot creation. They would have the model, in wireframe, and then he would design the shot. That shot would then be correlated with a stage that was across the street that had a grid on the floor and on the walls, and basically you could move the camera to that point on the grid and then put the model here and then shoot the shot. So basically he over-designed the system and made it this extremely complicated setup, and that basically, it didn't work.
It was a nightmare.
Well, I just think we were led to believe that lots of things were possible and could, were achievable. And we were so far into the movie when suddenly, the rug was pulled out from underneath us.
Roddenberry and Wise came to the screening room with the people from Able to see what they had to show for themselves.
They finally show some special effects months and months and months into production, and it's a potato on a motion control stand going across, and that's all they had shot because they had not finished the new miniature of the Enterprise.
Literally everything that we had been sold turned out to be nothing but a bill of goods. Bob had shot half the movie predicated on having a design for effects, only to be told that, sorry, not going to work out.
Then there was even less time to get everything done.
That meant that the studio had to accomplish 2 years' worth of special effects work in less than 1 year's time. This necessitated hiring 2 crack special effects experts to put together a team.
We got, fortunately, Doug Trumbull, who I'd worked with before, and John Dykstra were available at the time, so both of them came on to do the special effects. And because we were so late, so far behind, they had to work their outfits practically day and night for 7 days a week to do the work and get it done.
There were people sleeping on cots in the studio. People had hotel rooms nearby where they could shower up occasionally or grab a few hours sleep, and then it was back to the 24-hour grind. Talk
about asking somebody to run the 400 meters and tie one leg and one arm behind their back. That is what Bob had to do. And the thing that is so amazing about it, and I remember about it, is what an incredible pro he was. The general came front and center and said, okay, here's the plan, and marshaled everybody together and, really took what was basically a disaster, and turned it into a success.
About 600 shots in about 9 months of time, I think, something like that. So we could get it done and get it on the film and get ready for our release.
It's just one of those movies that was unbelievably ambitious, pushing all the edges of technology, with all the best intentions, mistakes that were made. And if the expression, that what does not kill me makes me stronger, is in fact true, well, there's probably nothing in my career that, didn't kill me more than that.
Because they were so late in getting the effects work shot, they cut random lengths of leader into the movie for the shots, and some of these shots were way too long because they cut in too much leader, but they'd already scored the movie, so they couldn't shorten it.
If something comes in of the cloud of Voyager, passing through Voyager, and it's 5 minutes, that's what goes into the movie. There's no way to make that shorter. There's no way to abbreviate it.
So some of these shots play forever. That's the other problem. When you show the audience too much and they get used to it, and it loses its pizzazz,
There was no time for a preview, which we always did, both for the filmmaker, so the filmmaker could see how the movie was playing, and for the marketing department to kind of, fine-tune the campaign. I remember Jeffrey saying, you have to come over and see this. They had rented a stage at MGM. They had lined up all the film cans, and they were printing the last shots literally the day before the movie was to open. And as each of the final reels went into the can, that can was driven off to the airport and flown, to wherever it needed to go.
They were literally doing press screenings for Star Trek the Motion Picture the morning that it opened. So some theaters that were commercially showing Star Trek the Motion Picture on Friday, December 7th, were actually doing the press screenings of Star Trek in the morning because that's when they were getting their prints, because they could barely make enough prints in time for the 857 screen release. And then they would go to theaters wet, like the one in Westwood. Like, I think they got the first 2 reels, and they were literally showing the film and didn't get the rest of the movie until like an hour after the movie had already started playing. I mean, that's how close they were cutting it. The screening of Star Trek the Motion Picture, the black tie screening, was at the K.B. MacArthur Theater. It was the first time a lot of the people had gone to a big black tie premiere. Remember, they were supporting players in a small TV show. This was a huge, mega blockbuster release. Robert Wise is taking the print of the movie for the premiere on the plane with him. He gets off the plane, the limo is, and the publicist for the movie is waiting for him, and he has the wet prints of the movie. Gene Roddenberry introduces everybody, thanks everybody. The film begins to roll, and people are really excited, but slowly, there starts to be coughing and quiet, and no one's reacting anymore, and it's going on and on and on. And people are realizing, well, this movie really could have used, a little more time in the edit bay.
We felt, editor Todd Ramsey and I felt that we could trim it a little bit after the showing because we hadn't had any chance to have a sneak preview, but the studio wouldn't let us do that. They were afraid if word got out that after the showing in Washington we were going back in and making some trims or shortening it, that word would get out, a feeling would get out that we had a poor picture, a weak picture, so they wouldn't let us do anything.
When we saw the movie, I was totally swept away with it. I thought it was great.
To suddenly be able to walk into a theater and see new Star Trek was simply an incredible experience. And I can't compare it to anything else. Things like this didn't happen back then. The Star Trek for many of us was our quote-unquote first love. To have it in theaters on the big screen, it just gives you chills.
I remember the anticipation of it was just huge amongst us. And I remember going into the theater and convincing myself it was really good. There was something off about it. We were like, why is Kirk so grumpy? Why is he, he's not the daring adventurer, and he's actually in a bad position. He's the one usurping this poor guy's role, so you don't like him. So there's a lot of stuff that I was grumbling about.
Chronologically, the motion picture takes place 2.5 years after the end of the 5-year mission. So everyone's gone their separate ways. They haven't been together for 2.5 years, so they're a little rough around the edges. They're all questioning Spock's motives. Kirk doesn't even know his way around his own starship. So if you think about it, it made more sense story-wise that they were not getting along, or they didn't really know each other that well. They had to rediscover who they were, and by the end of the movie, they did.
People talk a lot about Star Trek the Motion Picture, and they talk about whether or not it's successful as a movie. They talk about it historically. They talk about, how Wise had been, had seen 2001: A Space Odyssey and seen that as the vision for how science fiction would happen on the big screen. All of that is interesting. My experience was I went into a theater, and here were my old friends. Here was Kirk and Spock. I couldn't tell you at the time, if you got me as I came out of that theater and if you said to me, was that a good movie? Did you like that movie? I wouldn't have been able to answer. It was closer to a family reunion than watching a movie. I knew these people. It was like reconnecting with people I'd lost track of. So it was a much more emotional experience than it was a movie-going experience. It was a homecoming.
My sister actually rented out a theater, and she had her own little showing with a bunch of her friends. And I think I probably saw it maybe 5 times while it was being released, while I was out. I was amazed. Star Trek was back. I never thought it would be back. My dad couldn't have been happier. I just remember his face when he actually said we're doing a movie. He was working. Couldn't have been happier.
I think ultimately that film is certainly like the most cinematic and the grandest looking of all the films they subsequently did.
Not only is it the one true motion picture of the entire series in terms of scope, in terms of aspiration, in terms of telling a real sci-fi story, that I think you have to admire it for what it is and what it tried to achieve, rather than just misses, oh, it's slow, it's the motionless picture. I find that so small-minded when people say that about Star Trek: The Motion Picture. The dry dock sequence is spectacular. It's what film should do. It combines music and sound and visuals to an incredible effect. People say it's too long. I say it's too short.
I love the fact that it took a long time to go around the Enterprise. I wanted to see the Enterprise, and I wanted it to be on the screen for a long, not just, whooshing by at warp speed.
And no one watching that today would ever feel that, because there are how many hundreds of hours of Star Trek content that have come between Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and today. It was just unheard of for, a failed TV series to be resurrected on the big screen. $43 million. The only thing that had cost more than that was Cleopatra. And this was our little dinky Star Trek franchise.
It's an interesting film. It's certainly an ambitious film. At the time it was released, it was the most expensive movie ever made. And had it not earned out, it would have sunk the studio. It would have killed the studio.
During the production of Star Trek, there was another movie that was being produced in Hollywood. It was called Heaven's Gate, that Michael Cimino was making. And that movie ended up costing United Artists $40 million, which was the most amount of money that any picture had ever cost up to that time in current dollars. The end of the day, I believe we spent something like $46 million, even more expensive than Heaven's Gate. And none of us thought it would make its money back. But we were surprised that it did so well, and really relieved. We dodged the bullet.
This was the movie that made everything else possible. This was the movie that proved what Roddenberry and the fans had been trying to tell them all these years, that there's an audience out there that wants to see some Trek. And people were packing the theaters. People very much wanted to see a Star Trek movie.
It was an amazing piece of entertainment. I thought having that cast together and working as well as they did was just a complete hoot, and they were great. They were there on the team, helping Bob, get through the toughest parts of it. I actually had a wonderful relationship with Gene, and I think I kind of very early on understood so clearly what it was about for Gene, and it's a very simple thing: respect. He had gone for so many years with doors slammed in his face, with people not listening, with people not believing, people not understanding. He trusted his instincts. He really knew that there was no one that understood Star Trek better than him. And I was an interpreter, got along well, and he trusted me, and I trusted him. And I actually think that was one of the more valuable things that, I was able to do, was to be a bridge, where he didn't, give up or walk away or get pushed out of the equation. That, he hung in there through it. It was tough. I'm very proud of Star Trek. I think it's an amazing movie.
Star Trek: The Motion Picture is definitely wrapped up in nostalgia and love for the franchise, and it transcends simply being a movie. Had this movie been delayed 6 months, that might have well been a masterpiece. I still think in a lot of ways it is.